If my younger self met me today, would they be proud, disappointed, or confused? Certainly, certainly, I think confused. I don't know, probably a mix of all three. My younger self was certainly much more confident and certainly much more moralizing. Not in the sense that today I hold any less of a strong moral position in terms of what I think is right and wrong and how one might live a good life. But I would say that today, the way that I talk with people about morality is probably, or at least hopefully, a heck of a lot different than it used to be. I think I was younger. This is me thinking around probably 16, 17, 18, somewhere around there. Back then, I was much more accusatory, much more skeptical, much more really looking for people's worst intentions. Taking out a given word or a given phrase and jumping on it and arguing people to death over morality. And this kind of pattern, I think that's just how I survived as a child, because, of course, the way my father related to me was in the exact same way, where moral accusation was the name of the game. And breaking down your character was the name of the game. And when you grow up in that kind of environment and you're trying to defend yourself, to defend your identity, you have to be able to argue back. You have to learn how to defend yourself morally and how to turn the tables on the other person and accuse them of wrongdoing. And the more sophisticated your arguments were, and the better able you were to identify their moral weaknesses and lay them out in a way that they could not deny, and then double down on the accusation that they were avoiding it when they didn't immediately agree with you. And then in that sense, guilt them for even disagreeing with you in the first place. I mean, that was an art I perfected in my childhood in order to defend myself from my father's accusation to begin with. And not only that, but the environment that I grew up in, the people were actually not great people. They didn't have good intentions for me. They were often covering the abuse that they inflicted through, some kind of, broad moral justification. My experience of adults and other people at that time was one truly of people who did not have my best intentions in mind and who were eager to defend their own self-image and were eager to argue with you about it and to make you feel bad, or even suggesting that they might be doing something wrong. And so I learned the art of being on edge. I learned the art of being skeptical of people's intentions. I learned the art of believing that actually people were hypocritical liars who were always trying to dupe you and to make you feel bad. And at the same time, my childhood had so thoroughly confused me about what was right and what was wrong, had so thoroughly exposed the fact that most people don't even think about morality all that deeply, that I was attracted to philosophy in particular, that promised to be able to allow you to investigate morality. And especially early on there, I wasn't necessarily interested in philosophy or philosophers because I was trying to develop my own understanding, but because I was looking for the answer and the philosopher and the thinker who had it right, so that I could become a sycophant for them, so that I could borrow their arguments and argue successfully for the one true morality. Of course, that was complicated by the fact that I would go out there and maybe for a time I would be attached to this thinker or that thinker. Certainly the ones that were more morally absolute in their attitude and their tone. But of course, all their moral systems would leave me dissatisfied. There seemed to be holes of explanation, or they didn't emphasize this point enough, or there was a contradiction here or there. I found this time and time again with different thinkers, such that I had to try and think on my own. And honestly, I don't think there was anything wrong with that entire intention with us. There's nothing wrong with going out and trying to figure out, rationally what is good and what is evil, rationally trying to figure out what is the good life and how can I live it. And that's still very much a part of my attitude and intention today, is trying to figure that out, right? In more and more in greater detail and talk about it with people. But back then I was accusatory. Back then I was very much looking for the opportunity to call somebody else immoral, because I always suspected that they were calling somebody evil, because I always suspected that they were, but that they were hiding their evil under layers of either self-deception or justification or whatnot. I didn't have grace for people. I didn't have a sense in which people, I don't know, I didn't give people enough credit for their own context, right? Their own history. I didn't give people the benefit of the doubt. I thought of everyone as potentially an enemy. And I thought that way because, again, of what I had experienced as a child, because the people in my early childhood were, for the most part, enemies who did deceive themselves and did come up with any justification they could to make themselves out to be the real hero of the situation. And, who used at least the appearance of reason to do so. And so it felt very much heroic for myself, of course, to have a more or less a detailed knowledge of right and wrong and good and evil, and then they go out there and come across people who disagreed with me, assume that they were actually bad people, but just trying to cover it up and expose them, right? In one sense, there was a sense in which I got a sense of heroism and virtue by being able to pin somebody in a moral corner and exposing how really they were not a good person, or really what they thought was immoral and evil, even if they really hadn't done anything, just by their own thoughts, just by their own behavior. And I think the younger version of myself would have looked at that as heroism, as speaking the truth, as being unwilling to hold back no matter what it costs, to speak the truth no matter what it costs. I mean, that's the way that I had thought about it, at least back then. But in reality, I was kind of just an asshole. I mean, in reality, I was projecting, again, my own fears, my own hypocrisy, my own evil onto other people, and combining that with the influence of my own childhood. Again, I would assume that people were evil, and there was no room in my conversations with people for curiosity, for genuine curiosity. There was no room in my conversation with people for true learning. Or the only way that I would admit to true learning if somebody in a conversation could out-argue me, outbox me in the conversation. Because compared to, the other high schoolers, the other early college age kids that I was around, who had little to no experience articulating their ideas, little to no experience openly debating, little to no experience actually studying philosophical morality. For the most part, it was easy to out-argue, not because the position was necessarily more true, but because I had actually studied it. I had studied argument and I had practiced it. So for me, the sign of the truth was not the truth itself, but whether or not it could hold itself up in argument, which is kind of a relic of the Enlightenment period, where we sort of assume that if an idea becomes popular enough to I guess beat up people in a formal debate, that therefore it is true, which of course isn't really the case. The truth of an argument does not depend on how well it holds up in debate, but whether it is the case or not. But either way, I was very militant about my own philosophical morality, which of course would morph and change. It's been relatively consistent, but it's morphed and changed. But particularly on the personal level, I was completely hypocritical when it came to it. Maybe I would try to live a good life, but I would constantly violate my own moral principles. And there's a real disconnect with what I argued and what I thought and what I charged people with, and the life that I was really living and the path that I was really going down. So there was definitely this accusatory nature to myself. Today I try to lead with calm curiosity. Today I try to, back then, I thought that the world depended on the intellectual grasp of the quote unquote true morality. That is what would make the world a better place. And so not only was there this suspicious accusatory nature towards people, but there was almost a messianic urgency, a sense that, well, not only do I have to figure out what real morality is, but I must defend it rigorously against all opposition, because without it, then we're all lost. Without it, the world will descend into destruction. I mean, even the way that history had been presented to me, had been one of where single individuals took up a moral ideal in the face of mass opposition and won, right? And won. And there's a truth to that, and there's a deception to that. And the deception is believing that it kind of depends on you, and believing that the way that you go about even just improving the moral ideals of the people around you is through opposition, right? Is through arguments, is through division, is through that the improvement of the world must come by some great personal sacrifice. And the truth is much more subtle, of course. The truth is that sometimes you have to stand up for the truth, or you have to stand up for what you think is right in the face of opposition. But a lot of the times you don't. Meaning, you can just talk with people, right? The world is not going to end because somebody disagrees with you morally, and your own life is not going to fall apart if your moral perspective changes the conversation with somebody. And perhaps to many of you listening, that seems obvious, right? But for me, at 16, 17, 18, coming out of the circumstances that I had come out of, that focused so heavily on this moral absolutism and aggressive confrontation, compounded by certain thinkers that I was listening to at the time. That was my attitude. And I think the strange thing was that over time I had to learn the subtlety there, because it wasn't just the truth wasn't that you just go to the opposite end of that and say, well, everyone's truth is everyone's truth, right? You don't give up on the notion of morality or truth. You don't give up on the notion of influence. You don't give up on the notion of actually impacting the world through ideas. You don't give up on the heroic individual as a concept. You don't give up on standing up for what you believe in, and you don't give up on confrontation, but you recognize that not every situation calls for confrontation. Not every situation calls for accusation. Not every situation calls for moralism. Not every situation calls for jumping down people's throats because they don't have a fully formed conception. Right? You have to recognize that people are human beings, and that more often than not, what people need is not somebody jumping down their throats about a moral issue, but about love, compassion, understanding, help, friendship, relationship. I mean, to give an example that might seem kind of controversial, is that even as an atheist, but also now as a Christian, I have always viewed abortion as something immoral, something that you don't want to happen, right? Something that we're certainly not good, right? Nobody cheers for it. Nobody goes, I can't wait today. I get to go out and have an abortion. It's not a good thing that it happens. And the younger me, in my teens, and I would have taken that position. And if some woman or somebody told me that they had one, or they were thinking about having one, then I would have ripped them to shreds as far as I could, broken them down to tears if it was possible, through argument, through displaying to them through reason that this was evil and immoral and destructive, right? Thinking that yes, the way to actually help this person and change their mind and prevent them from doing this bad thing is to reason with them and rationally accuse them of evil. But of course that's far more destructive. It's a complete forgetting of the fact that this person is a human being, that they are weak, that they are, just like me, wrestling with right and wrong, that in all likelihood, because this is the vast majority of cases of abortion, likely coming from a situation of pain, of some sort of financial struggle, of fear over what this is going to do to them in their life. A person who's having very normal, very understandable concerns and fears and anxieties and worries, who maybe comes from a family that is pressuring them in one way or the other, who feels isolated and misunderstood, who feels as though they can't reach out and talk to somebody about the struggle that they're going through because they will be morally condemned and hated, ostracized and vilified. Now, today I have my views on that have not really changed. I don't think it's a good thing, but the question is, how would I react today? I think that today I would try to react with love, compassion. I would try to react with, how can I help you? Do you want to talk about it? Just even listening to them and being a friend to them and loving them as another human being, really. And being willing to offer help, right? And not pretending that I view it differently insofar as it comes up or insofar as they ask me. I would mention my views and say, well, this is what I think. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's what anybody here would want. I don't even know if it's what you would want if you felt free to choose otherwise. And then I would help them to try to choose. I'd try to help them to give them the options to choose life in that scenario. But I wouldn't come from this position of accusation or moral condemnation or putting them in a moral corner or trying to vilify them or bringing it down even to the level of rational analysis with them, because none of those things are actually helpful in that moment. What you have is a person who is deeply emotionally distressed and is going through something that would be difficult for anybody to go through, and in some ways is unimaginable to go through. A person who, again, is dealing with a tremendous amount of fear, anxiety, worry, pressure, guilt, pain. Does all that necessarily, excuse the strict moral question? No, but it totally changes the way that you approach that person. It totally changes the way that you relate to them. And this is reflected by someone like Jesus himself, who led with compassion and love. I mean, you think about the story of the stones, right? Or I don't know if that's what it's called, but the woman who is accused of prostitution and adultery, and the crowd is about to stone her. And Jesus comes to her and says, comes to the crowd. He draws something in the sand, which we don't know what he drew, but some scholars speculate he was writing down the crimes and the evil of the people in the crowd so that they would be reminded of what they themselves had done wrong in their lives, right? And he says, whoever has not sinned, cast the first stone. And of course, everybody drops their rocks and walks away. Shame. And then he goes to the woman and says, go and sin no more. You are forgiven, go and sin no more. And that's really this model of balancing, not balancing, but combining compassion and love, understanding, gentleness with righteousness, with the notion of right and wrong, right? And Jesus did this repeatedly in his ministry. He dined with the tax collectors and the prostitutes, right? He showed these people, in fact, he went to these people on purpose. He placed himself among those who were struggling the most, who were hurting the most, who felt the most burdened and guilty and anxious and fearful. He went among them and showed them compassion and love, understanding and friendship. And at the same time, upheld what was right, upheld what was good. And that's the attitude that I think I've gradually gone towards. That sense of suspicion, accusation, really, and this is the thing, like the accusation and the condemnation, not really to help other people. I mean, maybe that's what I was thinking to myself at the time, but it wasn't really about helping people. It was about seeming like a moral hero, right? It reminds me of the Pharisees who would go around accusing all of these, the drunks and the gamblers, the tax collectors, prostitutes, go around denouncing and calling them scum and devil worshippers and all this kind of nonsense. And doing it, not because they were concerned about the good, not because they were really concerned about right and wrong, not because they were concerned about helping these people, I guess, come to some sort of moral realization of the truth. And you might say, I guess, reform their ways. But they were doing this in order to see themselves as a moral hero, see themselves as somebody who is righteous and good, seeing themselves as superior, as more godly, more righteous, more wonderful, more enlightened than these people who came from objectively worse conditions than themselves. It reminds me of part of the way that I know God is speaking to me is because sometimes the enemy can speak to you, or sometimes you can have your own thoughts that speak to you. But God speaks to you in some distinct ways. The Spirit speaks to you in some distinct ways. And one of the ways that you can tell it's the Spirit is that, in the first place, they don't contradict the Word of God. But part of what the Spirit does, or the way the Spirit speaks, is it does two things. It never condemns you for sin. It's never going to sit there and say, look at you, sinner. What a terrible, awful person you are, slave to your sin. You should just be terribly ashamed of yourself, dejected. You should just, you are worthless, unworthy, unlovable. You're just a terrible, awful, bad person. The Spirit never speaks to you this way. The Spirit speaks to you in love. The Spirit recognizes that you're a human being with weakness, right? But at the same time, the Spirit does not excuse evil. It doesn't say, well, that lie wasn't really a lie, or that lie wasn't really a bad thing. When you stole that wasn't really theft, or actually your theft is really a good thing because it did this or it did that. The Spirit never pretends that what is evil is actually good, that what is unrighteousness is righteousness. It's always firm about what is wrong. It's always firm about what is sin, but it is also compassionate, understanding, loving, encouraging, empowering. It never tries to tear you down or give you an identity other than your free identity with Jesus. And in the same way, that's kind of the model, even again, going back to the story of the stone throwers, right? This is the model for how we actually interact with people in the world. And by the way, how we interact with ourselves. We hold ourselves to the moral standard, and we hold other people to the moral standard. We say, this is wrong, or this is wrong. And we lead with compassion, love, empowerment, understanding, help, peace, calm, curiosity, the desire to uplift, not the desire to break down, not the desire to destroy, not the desire to condemn, and certainly not the desire to see ourselves as a moral hero. Because, talk about one of the things that has changed for me is that, at least I hope, I've become I've developed a little bit more humility. Or at least I hope that I've come to recognize that, hey, I'm not exactly the moral hero that I pretended to be, or even that I set out to be, that I am weak, that I've been a hypocrite, that I've broken every single one of the 10 commandments, and probably every single one of God's commandments in the Sermon on the Mount a number of times, even while knowing it's wrong. And yet God loves me. Yet Jesus forgives me and encourages me and continues to transform me every day. And isn't that the attitude that we ought to have towards other people? I think so. I think that's the main way that I've changed. Not that I'm perfect with it, but when I was younger, I hurt people in the way that I approached morality. I hurt people in the way that I talked about right and wrong. I hurt people in trying to look at myself as a moral hero and as a good person, rather than focusing on, how do I actually help people? Even today, I struggle sometimes with the YouTube videos, because, especially I noticed this early on, but honestly, I still struggle with it, where there's a sense in which I'm oftentimes more worried about whether I'm going to seem, profound or intelligent or well-spoken, or whether people are going to like the video, or whether my metrics are going to be good, than I am about whether or not, if what I'm talking about actually helps people. And I'm trying to work on the daily, especially through prayer, or at least in terms of when I'm reminded about it, trying to work on leading with that sense of how can I help people? How can I help someone other than myself with this recording or with this question? And I should probably be asking that question and praying over it before I start up these recordings. Perhaps that would be a good practice going forward. In fact, I know it would be a good practice going forward. And so when it comes to that, I think my younger self might be a little confused. I could see my younger self arguing with me about that, right? Arguing with me that was cowardice, that was not standing up for what is right. Being confused about that. I could see me and my younger self getting into quite a number of arguments. But I also think that I would relate to my younger self in a way that might even shock them, because one of the things about my younger self when it came to other people, because of this confrontational, really angry kind of attitude, part of which came from childhood, and the desire to kind of just catch people and prove to them that they were doing evil, much like how I wanted to prove to my dad that he was doing something evil, even though I didn't need to prove it to him because he had been there the whole time. I would be able to relate to this younger self in a way that I think that would catch them off guard. and maybe even help them, because I would, unlike the people, how do I put it? When I was younger and doing this accusatory kind of attitude, people wouldn't want to talk with you, right? Because they know what you're about, and they know that if they have a conversation with you, an intellectual conversation, philosophical conversation, it's not going to be an open-ended, curious, rational conversation about good and evil. It's going to turn into this accusatory, moral condemnation, arguing outbreak, something that is stressful and painful and whatnot. And most people just don't care enough about you to endure that with you. But as an adult, I think I would surprise my younger self, because my younger self would come at me with these accusations. They would morally condemn me. They would attack me. They would try to have a rational argument, and they would probably be better at it because they're younger and the brain is fresher. But the one advantage that I would have would be patience. The one advantage that I would have would be calm curiosity. I'd be able to ask questions. I would be able to withstand the moral condemnation, knowing where all of this is coming from. Knowing where all of this is coming from. And I would be open to conversation with them in a continual way. I wouldn't shut them out. I wouldn't condemn them back. I wouldn't disregard them or the feelings. I would ask them questions and, maybe argue it back with them gently or whatnot. But I'd end up trying to be curious with them about it, and I would try to be curious with them about who they are. And I think that would be the biggest difference, because morally, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them all that much, maybe here or there, especially how, again, relating to people. But in terms of the big questions of right and wrong, I'm not sure him and I would have too much to disagree about. We wouldn't necessarily disagree about the virtues of trying to be a better person and trying to understand right and wrong. We would probably disagree about the emphasis of personal self-perfection, rather than orienting it towards the love of another person. But morally, I don't think we would disagree all that much. We would disagree on how do you actually go about doing that. And I think, in particular, the things, I think they would be somewhat proud. I think that they would be somewhat proud of the fact that I've gotten to the place where I'm writing and publishing, where I'm making YouTube videos and posting them, where I am being vulnerable, or at least attempting to be vulnerable and open as I'm speaking, that I haven't let the world corrupt my own rational understanding of right and wrong, even if I've changed my approach. They would be certainly baffled by the Christian thing. And I would understand that because, before I made the leap of faith, it made absolutely no sense to me. I'm not even sure I would be able to really explain it to them. So I imagine they would be baffled by that. I think they would be proud, though, that I was continuing, or I had gotten to the place where I was actually putting my ideas out there, because I was afraid enough at that time to go on the public way. And certainly didn't feel as though I knew enough to do so. I didn't really. So in one sense, it was intelligent enough for me to wait until now to actually start doing the more public-facing kinds of things. But fear really held me back for a long time. And I think my younger self would be proud that I had not necessarily overcome the fear, but despite the fear, had gotten to the place of public-facing philosophy, public-facing thought, that I was actually doing it. Because a dream of mine from about that age, around late teens, was to do exactly what I'm doing today, making videos about philosophy, or just talking with people about different kinds of stuff, and writing. That's what I've wanted to do for such a long time. I've wanted to read and write and talk about philosophy. And this channel has ended up being more than just philosophy, but that's if anything, I think that's an improvement, right? But I'm today doing the thing that I have for so long wanted to do, that when I was a teenager thought of as a goal, as a life goal. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And now I'm there. And I think that would be the thing that I think my past self would be the most proud of, which makes me feel kind of good. To kind of achieved my teenage dream at 30, or almost 30. I'm 29. I still got a couple months until I'm 30, but to have achieved my dream at 29 feels almost surreal. And it's not like this is where I'm going to stop. I mean, I've got goals. I've got goals for channel growth. I've got goals for a book. I've got goals for street evangelism. So my dreams, they've expanded. And I think that's good. You don't necessarily always want to stay at the same place as when you were a teenager. And I think in a lot of ways I've grown. I think especially interpersonally, I've grown. And much of that was because of things like therapy and philosophical insight, but also a majority of it has really, I guess, blossomed and solidified through my relationship with Jesus. And I hope to continue growing. I mean, I hope that in 10 years from now, because you could say about 10 years ago, that's where I was, that combative, angry, morally self-righteous, condemning kind of attitude. That was about 10 years ago. And I hope that 10 years from now, there will be things about myself, good things about myself, that would have baffled me today. So I hope that that kind of growth continues to go. It's kind of fascinating to see how much you grow in 10 years, right? I know the 20s are a particularly accelerated period of maturity and growth, but I hope to see a significant amount of growth 10 years from now as well. So I think ultimately, my young self and I would get along. We would get along okay. And maybe we would even learn from each other, because it's not like my young self was necessarily, I was more confident back then. That's what I would say. Much more confident, much more articulate, because I was constantly around people who were forced to listen to me or who were willing to listen to me at that time. You get a little bit more grace when you're young, I think. And they would argue back with me, and I would have to argue back with them. And that trains a certain amount of rigor. It trains a certain amount of confidence in what you're saying, confidence in your words. And as I got older, especially after, let's say 25 or so, I've just been away from a lot of the people that I used to be around. And there was definitely like a 2-year period where I was almost just basically by myself in my apartment. I'd go to work and go back home to my apartment and read and write, and had very little conversation with people, very little community. And that's changed more recently. Now that I've gotten married, I'm going to church, and I have more friends out here since I've moved. But there was a period where, really just self-isolated, you might say. And so I think I lost a lot of the articulation and the rigor. And that's part of the reason why I was doing this YouTube channel, of course, was to kind of practice the ability to even talk and reiterate my points. And I can feel some of that confidence coming back. But my younger self was definitely more confident in their ideas, and they were more willing to make mistakes, I'd say, more willing to fail than I am today. And I think that's, also just this kind of advantage that you have from youth, right? I mean, when you're young, you have a lot more time to mess up, right? You have a lot more time to do the crazy thing and recover from it. And again, people give you more grace because you're young. And so I just had a lot more confidence back then. I'd like to get that back more, but a confidence that's based on something more solid, based on something less fleeting than youth, right? Something that's based on ideas, based on lived experience. Not to say that the young can't speak the truth. Oftentimes the young are the ones who are burdened with confronting the world with its hypocrisies and lies. And I played my part for sure. But I think I learned that ultimately, when it comes to the long-term view of how you impact the world around you, or really just impact the people around you, it's not through accusation and moral condemnation. It's through calm, curious conversation. That reminds me, because this is what I wanted to talk about earlier, it came into my mind, but I was talking about something else, is that a recent example of this that I was actually quite pleased with was a couple nights ago. I got invited to this like barn worship thing that some traveling healing minister was coming through town, and they had a worship service at this barn. And to be quite frank, I was very skeptical about what she was teaching. I'm not sure it was biblical at all. It seemed very much like, what can Jesus do for me? And a power of positive thinking in a Christian lens. And it was a huge emphasis on her just kind of like selling stuff, selling her books, selling her shirts, selling her social media to us. At one point, she said something like, "It's not about whether you're going to give, but how much you'll give tonight in terms of the love offering." So it just seemed very scammy and unbiblical. And then at the end, she was doing the, I guess the healing, right? The faith healing stuff. And people were just falling on the floor, and it just seemed very performative and fake. It's not that I disbelieve in Jesus's ability to heal, even to instantly heal, but whether he chooses to do that through faith healers today, I'm not entirely sure. Just because so often it gets turned into this kind of scam, right? And people think, oh, if I give her more money, that means I'm more faithful. That means I'm going to be healed better. At one point, she actually encouraged me, my wife, to leave while she was doing the faith healings, because obviously her and I were not into what she was doing. And she said that, everybody's faith in the room was needed for, I guess, the faith healing to work. And that's just not anywhere close to what the Bible teaches. The failure of, I don't know, if a person is not healed physically or instantly by prayer, that is not a sign that they or anybody else doesn't have enough faith. That kind of talk is very exploitative, and it's victim blame. It's really tragic that it even happens today. But the bright side of that entire night is that we were helping a friend of ours get home, and I was following along. I was following the car back to her apartment, and driving one of the people who had been there, who had been to the faith healing thing, was driving with me. And we started off the conversation. They asked me what I thought about the service, and I was pretty upfront with them and said, well, I believe that Jesus can heal, but I'm very skeptical about what she was doing tonight. And at first I thought this man was part of the group there, part of, whatever faith, whatever healing ministry she was doing. And he said, yeah, I was pretty skeptical of myself. And it's a good thing to be skeptical. And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm not even, I don't have the Christian faith. I'm of a different faith. And I said, oh, really? Like, what do you believe in? And it turned out that he was a Muslim man. And this is really one of the first times that I've been in a situation with a person of another faith that is open about, I guess, being of a different faith. And I almost had that old instinct of like, all right, let me break out my theological knowledge and gospelize you right here, evangelize you right here, right now. But I just knew from my experience that wasn't the way, that this person would, either come to recognize Jesus, or that him and I would even develop like a friendship or anything like that if I were just to come down on the hammer. So, I have absolute faith I have absolute faith in Jesus. And so I wasn't worried about being sort of converted to the Muslim faith. So my approach differed. I started to ask him about the Muslim faith. And he described it to me, talking about, now I don't know whether this is accurate to the Muslim faith or not. So if this is inaccurate, then please feel free to correct me in the comments. But according to him, because the question I asked him was, in the Muslim faith, how do you get to heaven? Because this is really the crux of evangelism. And probably the most effective question to ask, I think, somebody of another faith. And he starts describing the Muslim path to heaven, where he says that essentially, and I'm not quoting him for word, basically what I got from it. Again, correct me if I'm wrong here. He says basically everybody, when they die, they experience like some kind of hell, some kind of punishment, you might say. But that punishment depends on the good works that they've done in their life. So a person who has been very pious, has sort of followed the worship rule, has lived according to the tenets of the Muslim faith very highly, they still get some kind of punishment, but it's much less severe than somebody who, like myself, who never worshipped Allah to begin with, and never prayed, never did any of the kinds of rituals, right? So everybody goes to hell, but punishment depends on how good your works were. And then when the war ends, which I don't know what the war is, but when the war ends, then everybody gets brought to heaven. essentially. Everyone gets redeemed. It's a really interesting version of like works-based universalism. And I'd never really heard that before. So it was a surprise to me to hear that that's the way things work in the Muslim faith. But it all kinds of relates back to the same problem, which is what I pointed out, which is something like, how can our work get us into heaven? Because, and this is what I said to him, I said, what confuses me about this is that, and this is genuine confusion in relation to the Muslim faith. What confuses me about what he talked about is that God is the source of all goodness. And he agreed with this. I mean, God is the source of everything good in all the world, even the good works that we do. God is the source of it. He's the one who enables us to do good works at all. And he agreed with this. And I said, so if God is the ultimate source of everything good, including our own good works, how is it that we can be credited with our good works, right? How can our good works merit us anything when God is the true source of that? It's like a surgeon saves your life, and you don't thank the surgeon, you thank some sort of patient that's sitting outside the window, something like that, right? How can good work be credited to me if their source is ultimately in God? And of course, that line of thinking leads you to think, okay, well, if my good works can't be credited to me, then, what's my hope of actually avoiding hell, or actually avoiding, you might say, I guess, the severest punishment in the Muslim faith? And the whole universalist thrust of the latter half of what he's saying, that would be a different approach. But that recognition that God is the source of all good things, meaning that our own works can't be credited to us, but must be credited to God, and so can't stand as a substitution for us. That actually made him pause, for a moment. He had to kind of think about that. It stuck in him. And I mean, he kind of skipped over it, and we started talking about Mary and Jesus, and he brought in an example of, if Mary was the son of the king of Egypt, would that mean that the king of Egypt is God? And so I kind of honestly, the conversation got a little sidetracked after that, but I noticed the pause. And I've sort of registered that in my brain as a success. And a success because, I have no expectation in a conversation like that, having a conversation with a devout Muslim, that in one conversation, that I am going to, by my wisdom and wit, somehow convert this man. Conversion, coming to faith in Jesus or God, has nothing to do with me, or what I can do. If, God is good, and God can convert that man right there and then. But oftentimes, God doesn't like to work that way. He likes to work through relationships with people. And, for an opening conversation, I think that we were both pretty open to each other, to understanding each other, not necessarily to converting, because I certainly wasn't open to converting, but I was open to trying to understand what it means to be a Muslim and what it means to have the Muslim faith and that perspective. And he was open to, again, hearing what I had to say. He didn't drown me out, shout me out. And it was a conversation, very open, genuine, curious kind of conversation, which actually felt like there was progress, because he listened long enough. I mean, I listened long enough to hear his version of how you get into heaven. And he listened long enough to hear something that made him stop and think. And that's actually, might actually be progress. Maybe God didn't use it that night to change him, but maybe that's one moment in a string of moments throughout this man's life that might lead him to Jesus in the end. And I bet you that question is going to bother him. So, and by the way, for all you budding evangelists out there, the number one way to get to the center of the evangelistic message when talking to somebody about another faith is to drive towards that question, how do you get to heaven? Because Christianity is unique in the sense that it does not depend on works at all, but on grace. Whereas every other religion depends on some version of works. If you get there, and you can talk about the necessity for grace, rather than getting swamped in conversations about different versions of the Bible, or whether Jesus was truly the Son of God, or any of these kinds of things. I mean, once you get to the genuine path towards heaven, everything else that is a part of the Christian faith flows from that one question. And again, Christianity is unique in the sense that it doesn't depend on good works, because it knows that all goodness comes from God, and that no goodness can be ascribed to us. So always drive towards that question of, according to your faith, how do we get into heaven? All right. According to your faith, how do we get into heaven? You get there, you get to the meat of the question, which is the most important part of that. And then everything else, the legitimacy of the word, the divinity of Jesus Christ, the commandments, all that kind of stuff, that flows out of that question of how do you get to heaven. But I've gotten home now, so I'm going to head inside. But, if you guys have any thoughts at all about what I just talked about, then please leave it in the comments. If you had a similar journey to this, similar past, I would love to hear more about it, just to know that maybe I'm not the only one out there, right? And really just any thoughts at all. I would love if you guys would share that with me in the comments. And if you think that somebody else would get some benefit out of this conversation, then I hope that you share it with them. If you like this video, please give it a like. And if you want more videos like this, then please subscribe. And as always, thank you guys for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.